Welcome to part two of our summer-long troll through the book of Job. How many people have actually been reading it with some frequency? Okay, okay, that's good. Great. I know
It
it's easy to get behind, right? And then it's hard to catch up.
is.
Um,
Mhm.
I was pleased by the fact that the books I was trying to give emails that were only like 300 words long plus my introductions, and it worked out pretty well for the length of
Yeah.
summer
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
we have to
yeah.
be able to do
It
that.
did.
So I thought today what I want to do is focus mostly on the second half and a lot on God's answer to Job. But just to sort of reorient us a bit, I just wanted to remind you of the whole structure of the thing now that you've sort of read it all. Um, so it starts, as you may recall, with this kind of folktale beginning, right? The bet, once upon a time, God and Satan, God is up in heaven and Satan comes by and God says, "Hey, what have you been seeing down there on earth?" And Satan tells him about Job and makes this bet that if Job lost everything, all of his wealth and his health and his children, he'd probably drop God like a cold stone right away. He'd just say, "Forget it. Now that I've lost everything, God's obviously betrayed me. I have no use for God." And God says, "I don't think so. I think that Job is going to stay righteous and he's going to stay loyal to me, even if you take away everything. So you can take away everything except his life um, and his wife." So that's what happens, right? And that's in prose. And then there's this epilogue where God criticizes the three friends, and Job's wealth is restored, and he gets 10 new kids, and he lives happily ever after. And it really, really sounds like a folk tale at that point, right? And the scholars tell us that this was a story which the Hebrews borrowed from non-Hebrews, like other people in the Middle East. This is a story once upon a time the gods made a bet, and the Hebrews just reworked it so that it could become a
Yeah.
Jewish story.
And it
So
was a folk tale.
yeah, it was a folk tale, and it reads exactly like a folk tale, right? Just feels like a folk tale. And then what the Hebrew writers did was they added the middle bits, right? So they added Job's lament, "I wish I'd never been born," and then that back and forth between Job and his three friends, and then Job's final statement, and then God speaks a couple of times, and Job has a couple of very short replies, and then the epilogue. And that part all flows just fine, but the text that you read, also had these sections, so these yellow sections. The second half, after we had our first Zoom call, the second half started with the hymn to wisdom,
Yeah.
which,
Mm-hmm.
unlike anything in that first half, is just presented as a hymn. Like nobody says it. It's not said by one of the friends. It's not said by Job. It just sort of appears. It's like an interlude. And then what's also added is Elihu's speech. Elihu's speech. And he's the fourth friend, the young hothead who says, "I've been listening to you guys, and I think you've got it all wrong." And he makes a big speech. And if you took out Elihu's speech, you wouldn't miss anything in terms of the way the plot flows.
You wouldn't be irritated by his snooty britches.
Yeah, that's right. He's very annoying. But when Job does his final statement, if you were to just skip to God's speech, God then says, then God shows up out of the whirlwind in response to Job. Like it flows perfectly without Elihu's speech. So scholars believe that these two yellow parts were added later.
Mhm.
So what you have is really a story that has evolved over time. It starts off as a folk tale, the beginning and the end, which are preserved in prose. And then there was another layer, all this stuff which is in white text. And then later on, somebody added the hymn to wisdom and Elihu's speech.
Mhm.
So if anyone ever tells you that the Bible is this singular, perfect text, well, no,
Yes.
it's not. Like this one has all sorts of fingerprints over it. It's like a house which has undergone several renovations.
Yes.
I mean, you can read it as
Right.
when you walk into a house, you don't go, I think I'll go in the back door because the porch is new and I want to be in the original house. We don't do that. You just
Ah,
walk in through the
ah,
front door, right? Because the
yeah.
house is the house. We don't care about when it was renovated or which parts were put on when. And it's okay to read the Bible as a holistic thing, but in this particular case, whoever stuck those bits in didn't do a very good job of doing the suturing, so it's kind of obvious where the bits got stuck in. So I'd like to focus on the second part of the book, which starts with the hymn to wisdom. And we'll talk about the hymn to wisdom, and we'll talk about Job's final statements, and then get into God's reply, which I suspect we will take a long time to talk about, because what God says is not at all what one is expecting and may not even be satisfying, which is, surprising, since it's God. We expect God to say satisfying things. But before I get there, did anyone have any sort of general comments or problems or comments that you want to get off your chest now, and then I can make a note and try and address them as we go?
Well, the whole book is, I won't say suffers from, but certainly possesses ambiguity.
Mm-hmm.
And one can't be altogether sure about a lot of this stuff, even in the important spots at the end.
Yeah, it is kind of confusing, right? And especially at the end when he starts talking about Leviathan and Behemoth, like, what has this got to do with Job? Like, but we'll get into that.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah, it's very odd. It's definitely
Apparently, Behemoth and Leviathan are an integral part of ancient Middle Eastern
Near
eschatology.
Yeah. Near Eastern eschatology, where the gods are God, takes on serpentine figures, and we have it in the Old Testament with Leviathan.
Mm-hmm.
That is ancient Near Eastern lore. I'm interested in the question of that is there any difference between the God at the beginning that Job fears so much, and the God at the end, which seems he's doing a power play where Job would fear again, but maybe that's not so. Maybe it's just Job is awestruck. But that's a question I raised as I went through it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Job obviously and spiritually he evolves, but I don't know that God does.
Doesn't have to.
Maybe God shouldn't, but anyway.
Yeah, fair question. Totally. Any other? Did you have any feelings? Like, were there days when you read it and went, nah, just
Yeah, I was disappointed in God, in God's role. First of all, from the very beginning, I really had a hard time with making this bet with Satan.
Mm-hmm.
And then we went along, and it was very interesting, and we learned a lot from the first section, and then it became more and more like a fairy tale. And the thing I didn't understand was when he spoke to Job in the end, he had to make himself look so big and so great. And I thought, well, is that really what God's all about? I was confused by that. I lost a little faith in God there.
Mm.
It certainly sounded like a harangue of some sort.
Yep.
Bullying.
Redeeming moment is when God says, your friends didn't say the truth, but Job did about me. Whoa, that's a bit of self-awareness we don't attribute to God.
Yeah, that's right. Job says that I don't play fair, and he was right.
Yes.
Yeah, which isn't at all what we expect to hear from God. So, okay, well, all fair, and hopefully as we go through this, some of those questions will be illuminated. I don't know if they'll be solved, perhaps they'll be illuminated. So I thought we could just try to start with the wisdom hymn, which, as I said, just seems like an insertion. It kind of feels like I don't know, it's like the halftime, you're broken for halftime, and then you come back and there's like a little intermezzo, a little piece of music, which, recaps some of the themes and anticipates some of the themes to come. The hymn to wisdom is sort of like that. So why don't we read a little bit of it? We don't have to read the whole thing. Can I get 3 readers for this, please? Okay, so Kathy, Wendy, and Mary. Okay, Just share the screen here. Oops, sorry. Okay. So yeah, so we did that. Sorry. Okay, great. So if Kathy, you could go first, please.
Sure. The hymn to wisdom. But where can wisdom be found? Where does understanding dwell? No mortal comprehends its worth. It cannot be found in the land of the living. The deep says, it is not in me. The sea says, it is not with me. It cannot be bought with the finest gold, nor can its price be weighed out in silver. It cannot be bought with the gold of Ophir, with precious onyx or lapis lazuli. Neither gold nor crystal can compare with it, nor can it be had for jewels of gold. Coral and jasper are not worthy of mention. The price of wisdom is beyond rubies.
Great, thank you. And Wendy, if you could read this part, please.
The topaz of Cush cannot compare with it. It cannot be bought with pure gold. Where then does wisdom come from? Where does understanding dwell? It is hidden from the eyes of every living thing, concealed even from the birds of the sky. Destruction and death say, only a rumor of it has reached our ears. God understands the way to it, and he alone knows where it dwells. For he views the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens.
Great, thank you. And Mary, if you could read this part, please.
When he established the force of the wind and measured out the waters, when he made a decree for the rain and a path for the thunderstorm, then he looked at wisdom and appraised it. He confirmed it and tested it. And he said to the human race, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so what is your reaction to that? Is that your understanding of wisdom?
Not the last two lines.
I wonder if wisdom is tangible enough that we can hand it from generation to generation, or is it something each person, each society, each generation develops for themselves? And if that is so, is it tied to contemporary thinking, contemporary events? Is it only wisdom to understand the world as it is and just history if we look back and say, you know, that makes sense for those times? I don't know. The fear of the Lord is understanding. Maybe by that they mean just staying in the present moment and being aware of how life can change.
Yeah, I mean, the hymn has made it very clear that even death and destruction and the stars have no idea where to find wisdom. So wisdom is something which is only in God's keep, right? So it's rare, it's precious, but it's also remote, right? God has it, but nobody else does. And it's an odd thing to say in the context of this poem, right? In that Job we saw last time we discussed this, Job goes through this sort of, evolution in his understanding of life, where he starts off just, saying, I'm suffering, I wish I were dead, to he starts to recognize that, oh, I'm not the only innocent person who suffers. There's other innocent people who suffer. And conversely, there's wicked people who prosper, and God doesn't stop them, right? And he gets a very nuanced idea of what it's like to live with suffering. So it's very personal, right? It's not sociological. It's very, very personal. And then this hymn to wisdom shows up and says, there's no possibility for human beings to have wisdom, right? Only God has wisdom, which seems quite out of keeping with what we're seeing Job go through, because Job seems to be developing wisdom, right? I mean,
There does seem to be that movement from the personal and the intimate to the cosmic, and in God's response, and throughout the poem.
Yeah, so it's sort of an anticipation of God's response, right? Which is
Yes.
very ambiguous and perplexing and sort of beyond human understanding in a way, right? You know, he keeps saying, "Who are you to question me?" And we'll get to that.
Yeah.
So
And
in a weird way, like this intermezzo is anticipating God's response.
God's response. Right.
Um,
I didn't come away from reading the hymn to wisdom thinking that wisdom only dwelt with God. I thought that line that, you know, in the last page that we just read was saying, you know, people can have wisdom when they fear the Lord.
well, it makes a distinction between wisdom and understanding. I'll just pull up that last thing.
oh,
At the very
fair
end.
enough. Fair enough.
And he said to the human race, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom.
That is wisdom.
That's the kind of wisdom you're going to get. And to shun evil is understanding. Right? Like to be afraid of God, to know that God has all the power. That is wisdom, right? And to shun evil is understanding. So that sort of that latter part is what you've been asking about, Wendy. Like, you know, is the way you live in the world at any particular time, is that wisdom? Well, in this case, it's saying shunning evil is understanding. Like that's how you get along in the world. But the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And I think that it's fair for us to say, no, that's not wisdom. Like we can disagree with this. You know, it's obviously been inserted into the text, and it's sort of like, well, I don't know. Wisdom seems to be, yeah, learning to live with the world as it is, even when you can't control it, right? Like very few of us have control. Well, nobody has control over the world. Vladimir Putin doesn't have control over the world. Biden doesn't have control over the world. We are all as much subject to the world, much more subject to the world than we are actors shaping the world. And the human condition is, okay, so how do you deal with that? How do you come to grips with the fact that you are going to be subject to forces which you cannot control?
And how do you come by wisdom?
Or maybe wisdom is not a what, but a how.
Oh, right.
Right? It's not a thing to be found, but a way to live.
There's a whole theme of lack of humility and then a development towards accepting the necessity of humility and fear of God really in Job changes to awe. And I think the Stephen Mitchell edition and translation and edition likens it to the medieval mystics, the cloud of unknowing.
Mm-hmm.
And to accept that, you have to be humble and say, I will not be able to know all. I will not be wise. I will live and try to recognize evil, but I will not be wise in that sense. It's awe that Job feels, and awe that we're being asked to respond to God with, I guess.
Yeah, there is no possibility of being all-knowing and therefore all understanding of why you are in the situation you're in. That's the knowledge you will never get. Right? God has it, but you don't.
Well, I think you have it to some degree through life's lessons, that you can gain it, but you'll never have the total wisdom that God has, because He's be all and end all, and but we're learning our lessons, so we're gaining wisdom, never enough to compete with it.
Right.
Maybe in part, wisdom is recognizing that we don't know everything.
That's
Mm-hmm. Yeah, humility again, right?
True, yes.
You know, and don't forget that, you know, Jesus said that, you know, you need to be like children to get into the kingdom of God, right? Because children know that they don't know.
And but remain curious.
Mm-hmm. Yep. But
maybe having the sense that you know better is trying to be like God, saying you know everything, you've arrived.
mm-hmm.
But
Job starts off feeling he knows better. He knows better. I've got the answer. I'm good.
some of us are still recovering know-it-alls, so.
Early recovery, some of us.
Well,
I have an issue with the
yep.
word fear. I think that that's a red herring, maybe translated poorly back in the day in order to make people listen. But I think to think of it as fear is to confuse ourselves.
What's the Hebrew word and what does it involve? Because the Old Testament is full of fearing God, and that's the you worship. And certainly the other ancient cultures feared their gods. That was how you survived. But maybe the Hebrew word is more nuanced. I don't know.
I gather, I mean, when people translate the word in Hebrew, it can either go to fear or awe. Like both of those interpretations
Oh, really?
are reasonable. And that's something to keep in mind. But like, you know, wisdom is
Right.
fear at the beginning of wisdom is something which shows up in the Psalms as well. This isn't unique to the book of Job at all. And let's sort of park that idea for a while, because it will come back as we encounter God's response to Job. And what I thought we might do is look at Job's final statement, right? Because Job has been saying, I want a hearing with God, right? He says, you know, I want to be in God's court. I want to be able to make my case to God. So very much like a court case, Job makes a final summation of his argument. Hoping that he would hoping but not really expecting to get an audience with God.
Which also suggests that the relationship is adversarial.
Yeah, for sure. And he thinks that God has done him wrong, right? So
and it's left to God to show the evidence.
Yeah, and even show up for the trial, right? And Job knows that, you know, God is the judge and the jury, so he doesn't stand a chance, right? Like he's a circumscribed kind of
You
judge.
He seems to have forgotten that.
Yeah, well, he's. I mean, this is part of his integrity and dignity, though. He says, "I want to make my case to God." Right? I have the wherewithal. I have the courage. You know, and one of the things he says in the first part that we read was that I just hope that I won't be so terrified I won't be able to speak. Because in God's presence, the one who put together every muscle in my body, every sinew, every cell, who could tear me apart with a thought, you know, it's kind of hard to relax and make your case when you're facing that kind of judge, right? Okay, so why don't we look at...
By the way, should we have that same anxiety when we are in a posture of prayer?
You know, the Christian faith would say no. You don't have to. I mean, one of the gifts of the Christian faith was that it took a lot of the fear out of this. Yes. That we have been given a mediator between ourselves and the scary, infinite, omniscient God. You know, God has three selves, we say in Christianity, right? God has, you know, God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit is the traditional way of putting it. But you could also say the silent, maybe not silent, it's not the right, the unknowable one, as Bonnie was saying, the unknowable one, and then the more knowable one, which would be Jesus, or the second person of the Trinity, and then the Holy Spirit, who we know all the time because the Holy Spirit's down here blowing through us all the time and blowing through other people as well. So this is why Christianity really, really stressed Jesus as a mediator between humanity and God, because the God of the Hebrew Scriptures was often seen as so terrifying. All powerful means all terrifying as well. And Christianity kind of domesticated that and said, there's a way to have a reasonable conversation with God. Go through Jesus, and the Catholics later added Mary, right? Go through Jesus and Mary, and they will mediate for you. So, that would be the Christian answer to your question, Jim. You'd have to ask a Jewish friend about whether they see it that way. Okay, so I need 3 readers for this first chunk of Job's final statement. Any volunteers? Okay, Bonnie, thank you. Jim? Anybody else? Mary, was that your hand up? No, okay, Andre. All right. So Bonnie, Jim, Andre. Okay. So Job starts his final statement by remembering the good old days, what life was like before he was afflicted by God. Okay, so if Bonnie, you could start, please.
Job's summary statement. When I went to the gate of the city and took my seat in the public square, the young men saw me and stepped aside, and the old men rose to their feet. The chief men refrained from speaking and covered their mouths with their hands. The voices of the nobles were hushed and their tongues stuck to the roof of their mouths.
Thank you. And Jim?
Whoever heard me spoke well of me, and those who saw me commended me, because I rescued the poor who cried for help, and the fatherless who had none to assist them. The one who was dying blessed me. I made the widow's heart sing. I put on righteousness as my clothing. Justice was my robe and my turban. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy and I took up the case of the stranger.
Great, thank you. And Andre, if you could do this next page, please.
I broke the fangs of the wicked and snatched the victims from their teeth. I thought, I will die in my own house, my days as numerous as the grains of sand. My roots will reach to the water, and the dew will lie all night on my branches. My glory will not fade. The bow will ever new in my hand, will be ever new in my hand.
So how does Job remember life before affliction?
He was a good man and he was proud of it.
Yes, compassion.
And what made him good?
He lived outside himself.
Yeah, he lived outside himself, right? How did he do that?
His actions towards the vulnerable.
Yeah, what sorts of things did he do?
Acts of charity.
Yeah.
Care for the widow and
the widows and the needy and the stranger.
Sounds like Matthew 25.
A lot like Matthew 25, quite right. And this is something that we should keep in mind, right? That sometimes Christians get the idea that Christianity, Christ changed everything. The Jews were, drifting off, and Christ came and he set things right, and he instituted a new, wonderful moral order that was full of charity and love and kindness for others. No, actually, Jesus says really clearly, also in Matthew, I came to fulfill the law, not to change it. And in statements like this, we can see this is a portrait of an ideal Jewish person, right? In this text, someone who they don't say, in modern terms, I was living the good life. I was going to yoga in the mornings, and I was very, very calm, and I did mindfulness in the afternoons, and I was nice to my friends, and I was very loving to my family. And every once in a while, if someone came to the door asking for charity, I would, give a few bucks. I had a nice life. It was really good. No wonder God loved me. That is not at all what Job is saying. Job is saying, people gave me the best seats because I was so good to people. I was incredibly rich. We established that earlier. He has thousands of goats and sheep and stuff like that. But he made sure that nobody else suffered, right? So he was a really good guy. And this is one of the reasons why, when in the prologue it says that God says, what about my servant Job? This whole story hinges on the fact that we agree that Job is a good guy. Job has been doing the right thing. So the bet is unfair. The bet's not unfair, then this whole story is not worth telling.
Yes.
Right? And so this is a portrait of what, Jewish morality looks like in Hebrew scriptures. And, these sorts of themes are echoed in Isaiah and many of the prophecies, where the reason Israel gets into trouble is because it's not treating the poor properly. So it's something to remember for us, right? Like, I think Job is doing a much better job than probably most of us, in terms of living up to these values.
That sounds like 80% compassion, 20% creed, like more compassion than.
Yeah.
There's also 10% cockiness. People stepped aside for me, people bowed and scraped, and I was, my shoulders are back and my head's so high. And I looked down on them and I gave them
True. True.
Yeah. And in the section which immediately follows, he says that the people who looked down on me, like the thieves and the robbers who lived in the desert, now they openly laugh at me and they'll spit in my face. You know, like he realizes that he's just being pushed right to the ground and his face is rubbing in the dirt. Um, so, you know, he has been seriously, seriously humbled by this experience. And he also gives a list of, you know, he's still wondering, why am I in this situation? And he gives a list of sins which would make him deserve the situation he's in. So I thought it would be useful to read that too. I'll need 4 readers for this.
I'll read a short bit.
Wendy, Karen, thank you. Anybody else? Sheila, great. And Lawrence, thank you. And Zenny, if you put up your hand like electronically, if you want to read at some point, just let me know. Okay, so let's go. So this is the end of his speech. Okay, so Wendy, if you could go first, please.
Okay. I just have to move the faces out of the way. Okay, there we go. Chapter 31. If I have denied the desires of the poor, or let the eyes of the widow grow weary, if I have kept my bread to myself, not sharing it with the fatherless, but from my youth I reared them as a father would, and from my birth I guided the widow. If I have seen anyone perishing for lack of clothing, or the needy without garments, and their hearts did not bless me for warming them with the fleece from my sheep, if I had raised my hand against the fatherless, knowing that I had influence in court, then let my arm fall from the shoulder, let it be broken off at the joint.
Thank you. And Karen, if you could read this, please.
For I dreaded destruction from God, and for fear of his splendor, I could not do such things. But my trust in gold, or said to pure gold, you are my security. If I have rejoiced over my great wealth, the fortune my hands had gained, if I have regarded the sun in its radiance, or the moon moving in splendor, so that my heart was secretly enticed, and my hand offered them a kiss of homage, then these also would be sins to be judged, for I would have been unfaithful to God on high.
Great, thank you. And Sheila, if you could read this part. Oh, Sheila, you're muted.
If I have rejoiced at my enemy's misfortune, or gloated over the trouble that came to him, if I have not allowed my mouth to sin by invoking a curse against their life, if those of my household have never said, who has not been filled with Job's meat? But no stranger had to spend the night in the street, for my door was always open to the traveler. If I have concealed my sin, as people do, by hiding my guilt in my heart, because I so feared the crowd and so dreaded the contempt of the clans, that I kept silent and would not go outside.
Thank you. And Lawrence, if you could do this, please.
Oh, that I had someone to hear me. I sign now my defense. Let the Almighty answer me. Let my accuser put his indictment in writing. Surely I would wear it on my shoulder. I would put it on like a crown. I would give him an account of my every step. I would present it to him as to a ruler. If my land cries out against me, and all its furrows are wet with tears, if I have devoured its yield without payment, or broken the spirit of its tenants, then let briars come up instead of wheat, and stinkweed instead of barley. The words of Job are ended.
Okay, so that's where Job ends his case. He says, if I can't, if I did any of these things, then throw the book at me. But if I didn't, I still don't get why I'm in this position. So please talk. And then instead of God showing up in the book, what happens is Elihu shows up and says, I'm a young man, I've been listening to you old farts talk, and I think you've got it all wrong, and I know exactly what's on, and I'm really wise, so let me tell you. And he just goes on and on and on and on. And I don't want to go down that rabbit hole with him, but one of the things, you have to wonder, why is this being inserted here? And one of the things which Job has said is that God never answers the phone, right? Like, you can ask God to show up as much as you like, but God just never shows up. And Elihu says, no, actually, God shows up regularly in dreams and in visions, and angels will whisper into your ear and try and dissuade you from doing bad things, and they may be able to influence God. So God's always around trying to influence us for good, but, people like you, Job, who are terrible, you don't deserve to have an audience with God, so it's no surprise that he hasn't come to talk to you. Why would he anyway? That's basically his argument. And then God shows up. Against all expectation, God shows up, and God shows up in a whirlwind. So it makes a fool out of Elihu, right, who said there's no way this is going to happen, no way God's going to show up.
Yes.
And then, sure enough, he does show up. So what God says is obviously highly perplexing, as you guys said at the beginning. So we're going to go through this slowly. So let's first just hear what God has to say in the very beginning. Okay, so I'm going to read this part just so that you guys can sort of stay focused on it, okay? So let me just pull it up. All right. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the whirlwind. He said, who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched it? Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set, or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together, and all the angels shouted for joy. Who shut up the sea behind the doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the cloud its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness? When I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place? When I said, this far you may come and no farther. Here is where your proud waves halt. Have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place? That it might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it? The earth takes shape like clay under a seal. Its features stand out like those of a garment. The wicked are denied their light, and their upraised arm is broken. Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been shown to you? Have you seen the gates of the deepest darkness? Have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. So what do you
So I get to say my big point about the book of Job. These were all baffling things to an audience BC. We go down in baryometric spheres, and we know the depths of the earth. We understand cosmology. We have an idea about how big the universe is. We do open heart surgery, so we've stood on the edge of death and brought people back.
Yep.
So this reasoning that God's given to Job doesn't stick with modern people, contemporary people. I don't know where he's going to go with it, but in fact we can answer God. We know those things. We've done those things. We have experience. We have understanding of all of those things.
Yes, we have understanding, but God's saying, were you there when I set all this stuff up? And of course we weren't, right? We still
No.
theorize about the Big Bang. We weren't there. We theorize it. But Jim?
Isn't there a touch of self-infatuation here, though? And,
They're well matched, those two.
Yeah, it's certainly, who the hell are you to talk to me about anything? Don't you know how great I am?
yeah,
Right?
yeah,
It certainly sounds like that, right?
yeah.
Job's given the litany from the mortal side and mortal side, sorry, and God's giving the cosmic side. What I done, all the things I done.
As Wendy says, though, the limitations of their cosmology are pretty obvious.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. This is definitely a writing of its time, right?
Yes, yes.
More things are unknown than known by far.
The springs of the ocean. My goodness.
Oh, but that's ancient, and it goes back to the upper sea and the lower sea, and the springs, the Pagi are the original. That's why we use the word spring for that springs from this or that. It's an origin idea that the ancients had. That springs then produced the oceans. That's where it all originated.
Yep. And in Genesis, right, the heavens separate the waters. So there's water above and water below, right? Yeah, and when the flood comes, the flood is rain from above, but it's also kind of like rain from below, like all the water which is being locked up underneath the earth comes flowing upwards. So it's a flood in both directions because they didn't understand the hydrological cycle. They didn't realize that water could evaporate from the earth, go up to the sky, and then come back down. Instead, there must have been water up there, which comes down, and there must have been water down here, which comes into the wells, right? Two separate bodies of water.
And I understand from others, of course, that heaven wasn't all that far up there.
No. Yeah, it's quite close. The vault of heaven, right up there. But okay, so I totally understand why everyone's saying that God sounds like an arrogant so-and-so here. But what I'd like to do now is take you through an argument which is very interesting, which the biblical scholar and literary critic Robert Adler has suggested in his analysis of God's answer.
Did you say altar?
Adler,
Yeah.
right? Alter, yes, Robert Alter. And it's in his book called The Art of Biblical Poetry. Yeah. And so I'm gonna do the speaking here because it'll get too confusing if I'm asking other people to do it. So watch this. This is very interesting. This was Job's opening speech. Okay, after Satan had taken everything away and covered him in boils, this was the first thing he said. Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said a man-child is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, or light shine on it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let the clouds settle upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. That night, let thick darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Yes, let that night be barren. Let no joyful cry be heard in it. Okay, so woe is me. I wish I was never born. I wish the day that I was conceived didn't exist. I wish it could be blotted from the calendar, right? And we discussed this last time. So that's how Job opened his argument.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is how God does his argument. These are his opening words after he says, draw up your loins and be a man. He says, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. So, Job has said he wishes his beginning could be blotted out, lost in darkness, forgotten, and let no joyful cry be heard, right? Line 7. God responds by saying, with the story of the birth of the earth, an event which is joyful, when the morning stars sang their joyful cry.
Joyful cry.
Okay?
Right.
So it's parallel text. Job has been saying, if only I could have a hearing with God. But the fact is that God is omniscient, so God's been hearing every word that Job has said. So when God shows up to speak to Job, he says, I heard what you said. Now, you said you wanted a hearing with me, like a court trial with me. Well, here's my rebuttal to what you've been saying. Okay? And it continues. Job then continued to say, let those who curse it curse the sea, those who are skilled to rouse up Leviathan, the sea monster. Let the morning stars be dark. Let it hope for light but have none. May it not see the eyelids of the morning, because it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb and hide trouble from my eyes. Why did I not die at birth, come forth from the womb and expire? Okay, so he's talking about wombs, he's talking about the sea.
Talking about Leviathan.
And then God responded, God keeps going with his argument. Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness, when I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place, when I said, this far you may come and no farther, here is where your proud waves halt. He says to Job, have you ever given orders to the morning, or shown the dawn its place, that it might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it? And look at what Job said in the, sorry, I'm just going to go backwards here for a second. Right? Here is Job giving orders to the dawn, right? This beginning part, let the day perish when I was born, and the night that set him in, let that day be darkness. He is giving orders to the dawn. And God said, have you ever given orders to the dawn?
As a matter of fact.
Yeah, right? So he's saying, I've been listening to you, Job, and you would rather wish all of creation was shut down because you're feeling so sorry for yourself. Meanwhile, I am giving birth to the universe in a joyful and wonderful way. Right? So Job's opening statement is basically an anti-Genesis, a personal anti-Genesis, a denunciation of the power of life. I wish I were dead. And God's reply is to take apart Job's argument point by point, stressing life and joy and creation. It's a legal reply, as in a court of law.
But has he answered the question, why me?
No, and I will get to that
No.
next. I just want to establish that what we hear as God's arrogance, right, is actually God paying very close attention to what Job said. Job started his argument saying, I wish the day I was born had never happened. And God says, let me tell you a different story. Because when I create things, I create them in joy. And I create light. And he's using all the same words, right? Womb, sea, Leviathan, right? Like Job mentions Leviathan, and later on in the story, God's going to mention Leviathan. Keep in mind, all of this is a poet's construction, right? Like, we don't have to believe that God actually said any of these things. But this is a poet's understanding of what God might say. And it's a really, really sophisticated approach, but it sounds super arrogant to us. But
Yes.
that's because we're not thinking of it as a court of law. In a court of law, the gloves come off, right? You don't dilly-dally in a court of law. You go for the jugular, within the bounds of what you can get away with. And that's what God's doing. He's saying, you wanted a court of law, I'm going to give you a court of law. I'm going to rebut what you said at the beginning, point by point. So, all right. But obviously God doesn't stop there. God continues. And he speaks about, bizarrely, animals. I don't know if you noticed, but there's a lot about animals in God's reply.
Oh, yeah.
Which doesn't seem to bear
9
on,
animals.
yeah, and it doesn't seem to bear on Job's question at all. Why am I suffering? And God goes on and on about animals. Yes.
Stephen, that's somewhere in that there is there is something is implied that creation or the universe was not made just for the well-being of humans.
Mhm.
That there is more to it than
Right.
us.
Absolutely. So let's read a little bit of that those animal statements, because I think that they do have an interesting ethical implication, but it's just kind of indirect. So 3 readers, you get to read some beautiful poetry. Mary, Kathy, great, thank you. Anybody else? Okay, I'll do the last one. Okay, so. Okay, Mary, if you could start, please.
Do you hunt the prey for the lioness and satisfy the hunger of the lions when they crouch in their dens or lie in wait in a thicket? Who provides food for the raven when its young cry out to God and wander about for lack of food?
Thank you. And Kathy?
Who let the wild donkey go free? Who untied its ropes? I gave it the wasteland as its home, the salt flats as its habitat. It laughs at the commotion in the town. It does not hear a driver's shout. It ranges the hills for its pasture and searches for any green thing.
Wings of the ostrich flap joyfully, though they cannot compare with the wings and feathers of the stork. She lays her eggs on the ground and lets them warm in the sand, unmindful that a foot may crush them, that some wild animal may trample them. She treats her young harshly as if they were not hers. She cares not that her labor was in vain, for God did not endow her with wisdom or give her a share of good sense. Yet when she spreads her feathers to run, she laughs at horse and rider.
Wow. Yes.
True.
It's beautiful poetry, for one thing.
My goodness, yes.
But why would God talk this way?
Well, because he has a poet standing right behind him.
He's highlighting diversity, and he's highlighting that by limited human standards of what's fair and the way in which we might have created the world, he's done it differently. I'm sure if we were to create an ostrich, we'd make sure the ostrich had a nest. And yeah, and all sorts of, maybe is that what he's after? He's just showing us diversity and just the sheer delight of how complex and different things are, the animals from one to the other.
And are these, in the I've given you not all of the examples that he uses, but none of the examples are of animals which live within people's homes.
No, they have nothing to do with humans.
Exactly. Yeah. Absolutely everything that God says about animals is about things which happen out of sight of humans.
With that one exception of the donkey.
No, but it says the donkey, the wild donkey. He
But he escaped from humans, though.
Yes, but he's going to have a good life just fine out there.
Okay, fair enough.
God will take care of them. And I think it also really points out that these animals, even though the ostrich has these limitations, she's also got these great strengths. So he's saying, I know, you might see these small aspects and say, I'm not knowledgeable or all-knowing, but in fact, it's complex and nuanced, that things fit together and things work. It is much more complex and diverse than you see it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's joy in all of it.
Joy in the animals, yeah.
It's very joyful. It's like a nature documentary on steroids. And it's funny, right? Like Wendy, you were saying that, we know all this stuff. We know the science behind rain and all these sorts of things. And nature documentaries have given us a view of all of these wonderful things which wild animals do out of sight of human beings. But here God is saying there are things happening on this planet that you have no clue about. it's not relevant to you, and yet I care a lot. I'm taking care of all of it, all the time. You must not mistake me for an uncaring God. I care about animals you haven't even heard of. And like the ostrich, which is just so dumb in some ways, I've given it the beauty of speed. And the examples build right after this. God talks about war horses, like literally horses which go
It's
to
a
war.
wonderful passage.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
just like, the fearsome power of a war horse who is just thrilled to go into battle. Like, it's not trying to get away from the battle, it's happy to go into battle and be virtually invincible in battle. And then God goes one step further by talking bizarrely about the behemoth and the leviathan. And just for time reasons, I won't make us read about the behemoth, but I thought it'd be worthwhile just hearing about the leviathan, because it's sort of an extreme take on this. And I'll just read it. It's just two slides. And think of the leviathan for now as a kind of sea monster, and then I'll explain. I'll give it a little more nuance. So God says, can you pull in Leviathan with a fishhook, or tie down its tongue with a rope? Can you put a cord through its nose, or pierce its jaw with a hook? Will it keep begging you for mercy? Will it speak to you with gentle words? Will it make an agreement with you for you to take it as your slave for life? Can you make it a pet of it like a bird, or put it on a leash for the young women in your household? Will traders barter for it? Will they divide it up among the merchants? Can you fill its hide with harpoons, or its head with fishing spears? If you lay a hand on it, you will remember the struggle and never do it again. Any hope of subduing it is false. The mere sight of it is overpowering. No one is fierce enough to rouse it. Who then is able to stand against me? Who has a claim against me that I must pay? Everything under heaven belongs to me. Is God afraid of the Leviathan? No.
Apparently,
No.
Does God
No.
love the Leviathan?
Yeah.
Sounds like
Yeah, God loves the Leviathan.
Yeah.
well, he created it.
He created it, and he loves it, and he thinks it's wonderful.
Mhm.
Just as wonderful as those really bizarre looking creatures from like 5 miles down in the sea that we get pictures of every once in a while that look just so alien and weird, and you go, why do you even exist?
Oh,
God loves
many,
all of that.
many of them are beautiful.
But some of them are really weird and ugly and creepy.
Some of them less so, yeah. But to
What
others, fish of the species, they're beautiful.
But why would God take us so far away from human concerns? Why is God inviting Job to think about alien creatures at the far end of the world? Jim?
Find out he doesn't have.
Sorry, Jim, and then Bonnie.
Well, maybe seeing the vastness of the universe and its complexity and diversity, maybe your boils aren't as bad as you think, or as important as you think.
Well, when God meets Job, he can't really address the problem that Job was having, because he can't admit that he made the wager with Satan. So he has to talk about something else.
There is that, right? I mean, if he were just to say, "Oh, I made a bet with Satan," that would be no
By
answer.
the way, yeah.
But as we see,
Maybe.
like the poem happily drifts away from the original bet, right? Like the poem has become much more meta than that. Has become a meditation on human suffering, right? Which
Yes.
isn't always caused by God having a bet with Satan, right?
Yes. Have we ever raised the matter? Have you talked to us about whether the prologue and the epilogue are tack-ons that don't even belong there?
I think they definitely belong, but they're more like a pretext for the middle section than something that we have to take super seriously, as in something that might have historically happened. It's
Yes.
just to get the question on the table so it can be explored from every which angle.
And probably
Maybe-
people knew the story of Job as a fairy folk tale, and that would help make it more palatable, the whole reworking of it more palatable.
Yeah, and it's like what Shakespeare did, right? Shakespeare would take known historical stories like Hamlet and Macbeth and so forth and just run with them. Like apparently Richard III wasn't such a bad king, but Shakespeare saw an opportunity to ruminate about the nature of human evil, so he just went for it. He used Richard III as a story as the pretext. That is an artist's prerogative, right? That happens all the time. Northrop Frye said something
Perhaps
really
the
interesting.
reason God is showing this big world picture to Job is so that Job can grasp it'll be okay in the end. The world is okay, and whatever's happening in my life now, something will transpire, and the pain of it will fade. The suffering will fade, not the pain maybe, but the suffering.
Yeah. I mean, Job has been really clear in his sections that he recognizes that there's lots of innocent people out there who suffer and nothing is coming to rescue them. And I don't think that that's a truth which we should let go of. There's lots of innocent children who starve to death on this planet. Terrible things happen all the time to perfectly nice people. And Job has gotten that far. Like if Job is climbing a mountain over the course of this story, right? His friends are down at the bad things happen to bad people, good things happen to good people. They're totally entranced by what we would now call the prosperity gospel, right? If someone's rich, it's because God has blessed them. And if someone's poor, God wants them that way, right? That's kind of where Job's friends are at. And Job has seen through he's seen through the falseness of that, through his suffering, right? Like, back when he was being respected and everybody was kissing his ring, he probably agreed with his friends, right? But now that he suffered for a while, he's managed to get up the mountain a little bit. He's seeing more of how life works. And he's, as Bonnie said, his moral imagination has gotten pretty good, right?
Yes.
And then God sort of one-ups him and says, okay, well, yeah, like that. Here's a really cosmic view further up the mountain, right? And Northrop Frye says something interesting about this. He says that every question that you can ask comes with its own assumptions built in. It comes with a worldview built into it, right? So who stole the election, the Democrats or the Republicans? That question presumes that someone stole the election. It's just a question of which team stole the election. The stealing of the election is a given, right? And Frye argues that in spiritual matters, a good spiritual, in religion, no question is ever given a straight answer. Because if you were to give a straight answer, you would be accepting the premise of the question, which would mean that you'd be no further ahead when the question was answered than you were when you asked the question. Because the assumptions built into your question would still be there, right?
Yes.
So Job says, why am I suffering? And that question presumes that suffering is not allowed and that it's all about Job, right? He's not asking about why is there suffering in the universe. He's saying, why am I suffering? I seem to be the target of the universe. This is unfair. Why is this happening to me? And God answers by not answering. But instead, God doesn't give an answer. He gives a revelation.
So that is done benignly?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel like I'm better having read the book of Job, like.
Oh, well, that's true, yes.
We're all along for the ride, Job here.
But Stephen, William Blake apparently may be the only one who says the real theme of this book is the spiritual transformation of Job.
Yeah.
And so he does begin being a whiny so-and-so. And
yeah, and what happens, right, is that God takes Job further and further and further away from himself. Right?
Mhm.
We start with Job in his village, covered in boils. Then we're with the wild ass in the wilderness. Then we're with an ostrich. Then we're with behemoth, and we're with Leviathan. We get further and further and further away from where Job lives. And God's saying, this universe is so complex, you can't understand it. So your question is inadmissible in this court. It's too simple. It's too straightforward. There's all this going on. And if you want to know why you're suffering, I would have to answer why all of this happens too, because it's all interconnected and interdependent. And you know what? I care for all of it. I love all of it.
All loving?
All loving. I made it good, and it's not that and God's not denying that, people suffer, animals are stealing the ostrich's eggs. Pain exists in this universe, but it's balanced out because the ostrich can run faster than any horse and rider and has joy in doing so, right? And Job in the end he literally says, I realize that I was wrong to ask the question. I withdraw the question.
Right.
And he says something like, I hate myself, right? And
I repent.
that sounds really strong, but one of you sort of said this, like, Job is realizing that his personal concerns isn't the big picture. And Carl Jung argued that, Job has realized that has managed to say, okay, I get it. My ego was doing all the complaining, but you've shown me something bigger, which I am part of, just by virtue of the fact that you created me.
So you're comfortable with the King James version of 42 verse 6?
Which verb do they use? Hate?
Abhor.
Abhor. Yeah.
I recant. Whatever. Now there are new translations that suggest otherwise. That is a mistranslation.
Biblical language often draws these really, really firm distinctions. You love something and you hate something. And it's a way of saying, that's the thing I'm leaving aside. We don't like hearing that. And frankly, it's partially because white people don't like to ever be told that they hate in any way, right? That's why you can't call any of us racist, because racists are people who hate and none of us hate, because that would be a strong emotion and white people don't like to have strong emotions. Strong negative emotions anyway. We're totally in denial about that. Right? Like, this is not what a nice, genteel white person does. We don't hate anybody, so we rankle when we see the word hate. But if hate means I'm going to stay away, as far away from that as possible, I will. So, but what Job has got here, what Job realizes is, oh man, I was just feeling sorry for myself, and there's something so much bigger here, and wonderful and amazing. I mean, he's speaking to God. God's in a whirlwind standing in front of him. Like, that's the most amazing thing that's ever happened in his life. It could happen in anybody's life, that God just actually shows up and talks to you. And he didn't die. He wasn't torn apart, and he was given this cosmic vision from the beginning of time to now to the ultimate wilderness of things. Like, holy cow. That's amazing.
Steve, I don't think we can question that God is not present with our suffering and misery. I mean, he showed up, as you said.
Yeah, he showed up. And our faith.
Had been listening to Job from the beginning.
Yes, was listening to Job from the beginning. And I think I said last time that, Satan disappears from the story explicitly after the prologue, but is actually present throughout the whole thing, because Job has 3/4 accusers surrounding him, berating him all the time. And Satan in this story is known as the accuser. Someone who, will berate you and not have your best interests at heart. So just as Satan has been present through this whole story, through the aegis of those 4 friends, God has been present because God has been listening to them. And God has given Job an opportunity to go from being the spoiled, perhaps proud, rich guy. Bonnie, you were saying this, right? Like, he's going, oh, I was such a great big deal. I was big man on campus. He's gone from that guy to someone who's had his nose totally rubbed in the dirt and yet has now got much more compassion and wisdom and vision for other people than he had before. He has gone through a massive spiritual journey, which culminates in him saying, I withdraw the question, and I realize that my little self that was doing the complaining should stop talking now.
But in his ascending anger, does Job ever become blasphemous?
No.
No.
And he might become an accuser. I mean, Satan might move through all the players on stage here, Job's friends, and then when Job accuses God, maybe Satan's woven himself into Job, but then that ends.
Yeah.
Because God's bigger.
Yeah, Job does say, I believe I have a redeemer, right? I believe that despite everything that's happened to me, I have a redeemer. There is
Someone who will defend me before God.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, Job's testing out different things here, but within the logic of the story, God accepts that Job never actually, becomes unrighteous, never abandons God, because Job keeps saying, "I want an audience for God because I think I'm innocent here." So he never gives up on the idea of God, and so God wins the bet just because Job sticks around long enough.
Yeah.
Even if God had not shown up, Job still would have won the bet.
When God praises him at the end, what's he praising?
Sorry, say it again, Jim.
When God praises Job and then dismisses the other guys for being dishonest, what is he praising of Job? Is his honesty?
I think his honesty and his insight into the fact that Job was honest enough to say the innocent don't always get a good deal, right? Because
his growth, his openness to growth, perhaps.
yeah, and just the other guys were just touting the party line, however unrealistic.
Yeah.
And you don't get brownie points with God for doing that, which is interesting. Andre?
Yeah, so thank you. I was asking you and maybe some of the other scholars that what's the import of this in respect to the Bible itself and the bigger picture? I have to say, as I read it and thought it and I'm listening, I still feel that it's not the most important message in conversation, a little bit overdone. And I wondered what it must have had an important role in respect of the Bible itself.
It's not considered within the Bible. Job doesn't get mentioned a lot. Jesus does mention him once in terms of, or James mentions him, I think, in terms of his patience.
Oh yeah.
Which is funny because Job isn't particularly patient, really. I know we talk about the patience of Job, but he seems pretty impatient for God to show up. This is a text which is a bit of an outlier. It's one of the wisdom texts. It goes against the grain of a lot of the wisdom writings in the Bible, which sound more like the Four Friends than it sounds like Job. I would agree with Jung that I think that Job leads to Jesus pretty directly, in that Job is about why have you forsaken me? And Jesus says exactly the same thing on the cross. And that's the point at which every human being who thinks it through can identify with Jesus. Very few of us can say that we've always felt like we had God on our side, but almost probably everybody has felt at some point or another that they feel abandoned, and maybe there is no God, and maybe life is utterly unfair. And Job starts that conversation, and Jesus sort of takes it one step further and says, actually, even in your suffering, God is with you. And I'll prove it because I'll become a human being and I'll suffer and I'll die.
Yes. Stephen, a Jewish friend, we were talking about Job, and he said the rabbis of the Talmud just couldn't, were just bewildered by this and went on and couldn't make sense of a lot of it, or even establish its provenance or its timelines. And according to him, they were within a whisker of not putting it in the canon.
Yeah, and I gather during the Middle Ages, I mean, I agree with this part, they said, okay, it's just an allegory. It's just a story, which is fair enough. I think that's okay. But I gather that like in the 1st and 2nd centuries, before the Talmud was put together, they thought that how did this work? Job was actually guilty. He was guilty because his wife had tried to save the children and he hadn't allowed her to save the children, and therefore he was guilty of their deaths, and so he deserved everything that was coming to him.
Oh my.
Yeah. So, you know, I mean, these sorts of texts are good for exactly this kind of discussion, so that you can wrestle with these issues. You know, not because that there is a one right answer. You only get as much out of this as you are open to it, and you'll read this 5 years from now and you'll see different things in it because you keep changing. The text may stay the same, but you keep changing, and it's kind of like a spiritual gym that you go to. That, you know, the workout is the same twice, and so that's what I would argue a lot of the Bible is for that. It's really a way for you to wrestle with things and to see things which maybe you didn't see before as you get pushed forward. And I think if nothing else, this text is a classical text for saying that if it's straightforward, you're probably not understanding it.
Yes.
Or you're not getting much out of it anyway. Like,
it's certainly universal.
One uncomfortable experience after another, right? Like, to be drawn forward, you have to be drawn away from where you're comfortable. So progress means some degree of discomfort. Well, guys, I'm looking at the time. It's 5 to 9, and we've come to the end of Job's story. So I hope
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.